Startups begin in communities across the country.
Why does Silicon Valley get so much credit? My name is Nick Kastner.
And I'm Caitlin Clays. We're interviewing the people building startup communities across America.
But in the areas no one is talking about, the middle.
This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast by Mug.News.
This is Nick Kastner interviewing Cecilia Wessinger. Cecilia advises ecosystem builders and communities across the country on promoting an inclusive and equitable environment. So Cecilia, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick.
Yes, yeah. So there's a bunch of big topics and ideas I want to hit on. But to kind of segue into the conversation, 2020 has been a hectic year for everyone on a whole bunch of different fronts. And probably the biggest lesson that we can all take away from 2020 is that the American experience is much different based on your color of your skin. So if you were to check the pulse of America's economic inclusion currently, how would you rate it?
Well, if you were on a pass-fail, you would probably fail. I think that the statistics that I've heard recently are that 1.2 million businesses are still down, and 60% of the closures may be permanent. But when we're talking about how it's impacted people, you're talking about 136% of Black businesses and 28% of Latinx businesses that have been hard hit, and they haven't received anywhere near the funding. So we talk about PPP and EIDL loans that have gone out to supposedly small businesses and entrepreneurship, and we've seen the news on where that hasn't actually happened. While 13% of the Black population are business owners, or 13% of the population are Black or identify as Black, they've only received 2% of the funding. In Hispanic communities that comprise 19% of the population, only 7%. And the indigenous population doesn't even make the scale.
Yes, yeah. So not great. And almost all of those statistics were, of course, just very, very sad to hear. But I'm sure these problems didn't start to exist when the pandemic hit. So can you even speak on the structural, like long before the pandemic, on how much work needs to be done?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Actually, there are other people that are much better poised to speak to that, okay. And particularly with Black entrepreneurs. I mean, there are people like Melissa Bradley and Faye Horwit and Rodney Sampson that have been talking about this for a really long time and trying to create more visibility in the lack of funding that starts. We talk about the access to capital. We talk about access to opportunities, how redlining has been historically involved in where immigrants and people of color have been secluded or kind of isolated to, and how that affects your education, the people that you get involved with. You know the people that you know, and you know the people that you don't know, right? So you don't know the people that you don't know. And the idea of being able to access, right? So that's huge. When in a conversation with Faye Horwit, the president of Forward Cities, we talked about a conversation around, is it DEI, is it DIB, is it, do we include so all those little acronyms that you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. The belonging is the new hot topic, right? Mm-hmm. If we create a system of belonging, then we're able to talk about that. And one of the key elements that Forward Cities framework has is access. And until we tackle access as access to all kinds of things, access to resources, then we won't be able to get to the inclusion, the equity, and the belonging. The diversity is a fact, right?
Yeah. And all of those words you just threw out between diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're I have the feeling that they're not always used properly, and sometimes people use them interchangeably. So how would you define the difference between each one?
So for me, diversity is, as I said, diversity is a fact. We live in a diverse world. We come with diverse histories and mindsets and experiences and all of that. So diversity is just the thing. Inclusion is the action. So the idea of including people, and that's an intentional action word. There's a verb there. So in order to get to something, and where are you going towards, right? So I know that my friends who are involved in metrics are very focused on what's the goal, what are you solving for? And the thing that you're solving for is equity and belonging. Those are goals. And in order to get there, how do you process that? And that's increasing access. So access to me is a way and a path, and equitably is a paradigm and the idea and a mindset that you approach it with, where if we can create that sense of belonging where people all around the communities are involved, then we get to the belonging part, and the diversity actually, it means something, right? I don't the whole idea of we all bleed red, and we're all human and we all want the same things. Well, that's only true to a point. There is unique and special ways that people are different, and it's the celebration of those differences that makes a difference.
Interesting. And it was I guess just good to hear how you define them and separate them, but that they also feed into one another. So it is an obvious need that we need to improve this. Like, are there any, I guess, benefits that people may not expect, like once we have a society that is more equal?
Well, once it's not equal as much as equitable, right? So there's a nuanced difference between equal as the same and equitable as in it's not evening the playing field. We've talked about tilting the playing field, because historically and systemically, the playing field hasn't been level at all. So and I've got people in certain organizations that look at the ROI, the return on inclusion, like what's the benefit? Well, the benefit is that you actually involve your whole community. It's really interesting that people think about the robust and thriving nature of an economy, a community, an organization, when you realize that there's a bunch of people being left out. So how does your organization, community, and environment thrive if a big chunk of people aren't even being counted? So first of all, that's actually taking into account your whole community, right, or your whole organization, and that starts right there. They say that 30-some-odd% of millennials are looking for new jobs. The reason that they're looking for new jobs isn't necessarily that you're not paying them enough, but you're not giving them purpose and a sense of belonging. So if they don't feel like they belong and they don't feel like they're serving a purpose, and it's transactional and not relational, then they're going to leave. And that's true of anyone, no matter what age they're at, right? People stay as part of organizations and communities because they feel like they belong there and that they serve some kind of purpose. Otherwise, they will go somewhere else, because if all they're given is a paycheck, all they're doing is adding to somebody else's profits, then they can do that somewhere else and get treated maybe a little bit better. Mm-hmm. So that's the win, right? The win is that people feel engaged and that they matter, because you know what? People actually matter. And when we talk about people over profits and people over there's a simple equation that I was introduced to around this e-ship work, around the Coffin community, and it's people plus culture equals everything. And that's kind of a guiding principle for me, is that I think about the culture that we're creating and engaging the people in order to make things happen. So So there, you want your organization to be more productive, you want your economy to thrive, you want your community to be a place where people are involved and engaged and feel like they want to stay. You got to give them a little bit more of a purpose and make them feel like they belong.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So when you go in to advise organizations or communities on promoting that sense of belonging, what are like the first things you ask or talk about?
The first thing that I usually talk to them about are what they feel their goals are. Right? There's these immediate goals, or these the goals that they proclaim, right? Missions and visions and all kinds of things. And it's funny because you can throw that stuff on a plaque or on a website and call it good. And Donella Meadows in Thinking in Systems talks about like the actual goal and the stated goal. And the difference between the stated goal and the actual goal. What do you really want? And it's not, we want to be the best at whatever, right? Or we want to be the most whatever, the most prosperous company, the most recognized leader. That's not necessarily, that may be your goal. And if that's your goal, that's what you're solving for. So what do you actually want? And how do we get there? And then you talk about, Daniel Coyle has a great book called The Culture Code. And in the Culture Code, he talks about belonging cues. And the belonging cues are the ways you make people feel like they belong. And that is taking time and energy to actually recognize the person that you're talking to. Right? Noticing something unique. So time is the investment. Recognition, affirmation, validation, all those things that we seek as individuals, to understand what it is that like you recognize about me, or something that you notice, and it makes me feel like I'm seen, heard, valued, and respected, because you took the time and energy to do that. And then the next part about belonging is that there's a future set. So the fact that we will have a conversation a week from now, or we will do something in a project a year, for the next year or something like that. There's a future orientation where your future and my future are intertwined. If I feel like my future and yours are intertwined, then I feel like we have a belonging connectedness. If there isn't, and it's just transactional, which is what you see a lot with people in paychecks, right? I did this amount of work, you paid me for this, thanks, and then you're done. Those are like, and we can get into whole political discussions about right to work states and that kind of love them or leave them mentality. And this is what has perpetuated, because it's all about now, and it's all about immediate satisfaction, gratification. And if we don't think we have a future together, then people leave.
Absolutely. And what I guess what I appreciate about this advice is you can apply the framework and advice to like that should be an integral part of your company, regardless of what the goals are. And it can also like work outside of the context of inclusion and all of that. Like it's just something that to develop a strong company culture, every company should do. Are there any communities across the country that do this very well? Or who does it the best, or does everyone have work to do?
I think everyone has work to do, and everyone should continue to work, because it's really in action, right? You keep doing it, and then you get better at it, and then you kind of instill it to other people. I had a conversation around this idea of how everybody wants to get to mass collaboration. So in order to get to mass collaboration, what does it need? And so a group of us got together and we were ideating on this, and we thought about it very much like a Maslow thing, right? Maslow's idea is to get to self-actualization. So you take care of the base needs. Well, in order to get to mass collaboration, first there's an invitation. And the invitation should be specific. It should be very it should be very intentional about what you're inviting people to, so they know how to show up and they know what's expected of them. You can't just say, come and let's do whatever, and you don't know if you're going to a fancy cocktail party or a rave, right? I mean, those things kind of matter. And then you create this sense of community. So these are the C words that we talk about. Community, it's where you belong, where we build those relationships, and everything moves at the speed of trust. So you have to take time and energy in order to create that. Along with that comes better communication. People argue about transparency all the time. You're not being transparent. You're not telling me everything. Well, I don't know what you need to know, right? I don't have a relationship with you. You don't know what I know. You don't know what I'm working on. I don't know what you do. So when you ask these questions, like, what is it that you want? So it's not necessarily transparency, it's visibility. And that's where the communication comes in. Then you get to coordination, which is where it's like traffic laws. Right? So you don't crash into each other. And if I can communicate better and we can coordinate, then we know what you're doing, what I'm doing. It's the permeating of the silos. So you peek over and you say, oh, they're working on that. You know what? We can work in tandem or in alignment, or, you know, that market's taken care of and I can work on something like this. Then you get to mass collaboration. And when we looked at it initially, we looked at it very much like the Maslow triangle. And then looking at an inclusion framework, Faye was one of the people that pointed out, you know what, we've got it backwards. It's upside down. You actually don't start with a point and a pinnacle at the top. You actually start with that very small opening at the bottom, and you grow to a wider set. So your triangle gets flipped. And so the base of the triangle is smaller, and when you get to mass collaboration, it's actually greater. The funny thing is, when we showed that to Victor Huang, who was the vice president of entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation at the time, we were likening it to maybe Maslow's kind of upside down. Maybe your base needs are really minuscule, right? And then when you get to self-actualization, you're greater than. And he said, I always thought that Maslow was kind of like an hourglass. I'm like, what? And he said, well, you know, actually you get to self-actualization, so you come to that pinnacle, and then you infuse it into community. So, and which is like next level conversation, and we told him to go away because there's just not enough brain space for that. So you asked who does it well, and you think that the big communities, Silicon Valley, Oregon, you know, cultures that are more open, maybe your Seattles and your Portlands and your Austins and New Yorks, all those places that have thriving entrepreneurial ecosystems, supposedly are the ones that do this well. Well, I found that sometimes it takes a small community. I've had the pleasure of being in a place called Athens, Tennessee, where the population of Athens, Tennessee is, I know I wrote it down somewhere, they're at 53,000 people. Okay, small community, and I went to an opening of a co-working space. They had brought in Co-Starters, which is an entrepreneurial kind of coursework that they were introducing to the community. They have Tennessee Wesleyan College, which is a big entity there, and they were opening up a co-working space, bringing in co-working, and looking around at this very kind of sleepy little town. And they said that when those streets were not thriving, right, because small town America is kind of crumbling onto itself, they wrote things like on a big storefront with butcher block paper, you know, this would be a great place for a coffee shop. And they started people thinking in those ways. And when you kind of sparked some interest, a coffee shop went in where somebody thought it would be a good place for a coffee shop. So this co-working space, when we launched it, we had a luncheon. There were academics, there were Main Street entrepreneurs, there were a balance of people who identified as women and people identified as men. There were different ages, from students to the professors at the universities. There were people of color mixed in and integrated, and so it was a beautiful room. of a community celebrating together the small wins that they achieve together, because it's the stuff that they can only do. One of the gentlemen that was walking around, he had overalls on and he had a hammer, and he was kind of working, and I thought he was like the carpenter working on this co-working space. And it turned out they pointed to Mr. Mayfield, and what I didn't realize is that he's a dairy farmer that has a dairy farm in that vicinity. And as I got back to Chattanooga and walked into a grocery store, all of the milk cartons said Mayfield on them. So here is an entrepreneur and a staple of the community who rolls up his sleeves and gets his hands dirty and gets involved and actually gifted part of that co-working space and helped build it with, like, literally with his hands. And then the people at the university were empowered to bring their students and people from the surrounding communities. And so when communities like that work together, Ada, Oklahoma is another one. It's 17,000 people. They have a great international community. They have lots of international students. It's rural Oklahoma, right? And they do ecosystem building within their community. They're connected. They know each other. They trust each other. They support each other. And one of the best reggae bands I've ever seen is in Ada, Oklahoma. So if you're ever there, and the audience is diverse, I mean, it's what communities do, right? Yeah. We come together and we celebrate each other and we empower each other to be better than, because we can.
Well, first, I love vibing to reggae music. So if I'm ever in Oklahoma, I'll have to make sure to make a stop in that town. And with both examples, but especially the first, they seem like that it would be easy to apply that to a different community, like the paper examples. Like, I'm just fascinated by that because it seems like every small town in America could like plug that model in, which is very cool. So when I guess when working on inclusion, it seems like there's a balance that needs to be struck between intentionality and having it organic. And what is the best way to strike the balance between the two?
Well, I know that it requires leadership. And leadership, to me, isn't necessarily, if you Google a list of leaders, then you're going to come up with a whole laundry list of people who govern and manage. And that's not necessarily leadership. Governing and managing there are nuanced differences, and that's why we have different words for them, right? Leadership doesn't mean that you have to be in the front or you have to be creating the thing. Leadership is about resourcing and supporting. And Margaret Wheatley talks about the warriors of a human spirit who come, and there's chaos everywhere, but they create islands of sanity and they stay and do the work. So a leader to me is somebody who stays and does the work. And it's not by dictating how others should do the work, but actually working in collaboration and helping to support the people that are doing the work. So there's agenda setting, strategizing, checkbox. So those are your intentional inclusion efforts, right? It's we as an organization are going to reach this metrics. The metrics aren't the thing. It's actually the inclusion and the belonging that's the goal, right? The metrics are how you measure the goal. So sometimes we flip it. It's like we talk about technology. Technology is a tool and a solution for some of the things that we have to approach. The thing was that the technology was put in place for people so that it made people's jobs easier. It seems like now it's flipped. And so the people are the ones making technology easier. That's the same thing with inclusion goals, right? So inclusion goals are not your checkbox in how to get the most X amount of major identity marker people, right? We need more Blacks, more Latinx or Hispanic, and we need older demographics and younger demographics, and we need rural and urban. Those are really checkbox. Those are your metrics. That's how you measure it. What you have to do is set intention and strategy. So your organic thing is, it's not to have I remember when diversity and inclusion efforts had a lot to do with bring food from your community, right? And so they look at me, and I'm of Asian descent, and they'd say, oh, so bring the food of your people, right? First of all, there was no chopping and dicing going on here. Like, I don't do that stuff. That's why we have restaurants. That's a lot of work. I grew up in New York. I grew up in an Italian, Irish, and Jewish neighborhood. I make my own sauce, and I crave deli. So you're asking me to bring food around the people that I grew up with and what's home for me? I'm going to bring you some like Jewish deli food or some Italian pasta or something like that. It's not necessarily because this is Asian, but sometimes it comes down to that, right? I know there's a whole challenge with employee resource groups. There's this whole affinity and flocking thing, and people need to get together with people that they're like so that they can feel comfortable. There's a reason that we caucus and we get together with people like us. If you want to be inclusive, though, it's not just that. It's actually getting the other people to understand and just be aware that there are people that aren't looking like them or feeling like them. So working with people that aren't like you, that's a fact. Doing it well is an art.
And all of that, I guess, is just a good reminder and like valuable discussion, Cecilia. So thank you. So I guess I have one more topic I want to hit on. And to frame it, do you listen to any podcasts? Like, are you a podcast listener?
To some.
Okay,
not a lot. I have to admit, I don't listen to a lot. I do listen to a lot of audiobooks, but yes.
Okay, nice. Well, similar to, I guess, audiobooks and podcasts, a lot of times when I'm listening, I hear an idea where I'm like, oh, that's great. And I've really opened my mind. But then a few days later, I totally forget about it. So our audience consists of ecosystem builders, community leaders, and entrepreneurs. For those who have listened to this conversation, what action item should we assign them after? Like, I wouldn't... Yes, when this episode is done recording, what can someone listening to this, what is something tangible that they can do to help promote this type of environment?
Do your homework. Don't expect other people to do your homework for you. Okay. Right? It doesn't also just mean let's join a book club. That's the pushback from a lot of communities of color to say, we're suffering and you guys join book clubs and read books. So doing homework and talk to people, right? Like really listen and talk to people. So a couple of other podcasts that are around intentional opening minds. One of the first ones I was introduced to is called Seeing White. It's on Seen on America. And Seeing White is a lot about epiphany around whiteness and an awareness of that. Jennifer Brown does a great podcast called The Will to Change, about talking about how everybody has a diversity story, and that kind of introduces people to inclusion, diversity, corporations, entrepreneurs, thought leaders around that work. I highly recommend. I've gotten introduced to and have been taking part in a community of practice around bentoism. So bentoism came from Yancey Strickler, the former CEO and co-founder of Kickstarter. Somebody introduced me to his book, This Could Be Our Future. All those books along the lines of Simon Sinek's Infinite Game and this evolution. You're seeing this shift, right? Ecosystem building, it's a thing. So Yancey talks about this framework and practice called bentoism. It's beyond network orientation, and talking about what's now and what's in the future. And there's a community of practice that I take part in to frame how I think about ideas and make decisions that are value-based and not transactional.
Absolutely. Well, Cecilia, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us and instilling some of your wisdom, knowledge, and expertise.
Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully it was of benefit. And I look forward to all your listeners getting to expand their minds. And thank you for having this podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Now that we've learned about an ecosystem from the person building it, I'm going to link back up with Caitlin to clarify some jargon and take a deeper dive into this community.
All right. Awesome interview, Nick. That was really interesting, and it was really cool to follow along with that whole interview process. Did you have any major takeaways?
Yes. Yeah, Caitlin, thank you. Well, first off, great to see you. Yeah. And so my major takeaway was I really didn't know what to think going into the interview, besides the fact that the topic was inclusion and diversity and how do we promote both in our startup communities, which is very important. But I am a 25-year-old white guy and didn't fully, I approached that with some, I don't know if reservation was the right word, but I knew I had to go in with an open mind and intentionally didn't set expectations. But what I liked about the advice she gave was basically every ounce of it is good advice on just culture building and community building in general, and really like inclusivity and diversity, like it did relate to that, but it was also just like, how do you build a good culture and a good team and a team that wants the same things that you want, and how do you get everyone rowing in the same direction? So I guess I was refreshed to hear all of the advice, and I immediately I was thinking through how to apply that in the context of my own life right away. So like huge props for Cecilia for just, I guess, quality advice that was easy to consume and applicable. So I'd say that was my biggest takeaway, hands down.
Yeah, it was a very clear follow through. And I think that is definitely the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will actually agree with you. That was the biggest takeaway of mine as well.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Did you have any other big takeaways or anything that you had to look up after?
Yeah, so I guess we have this here for like jargon, because a lot of ecosystem builders can be super jargony or use terms or lingo that people aren't familiar with. And in this one in particular, I don't think I had anything. I was just, I guess, really like so sucked into what she was saying that if something did come up, I probably didn't it didn't register. I just kept on listening intently, but nothing. I did not look up anything afterwards. So.
But yeah, that was a great interview, and I'm so excited that we got to have this interaction with her. And then I look forward to the next episode.
Yes, yeah, of course, Caitlin. I will see you next Wednesday.
All right, see you next time.